Welcome to Conversations with B'nai B'rith International. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thank you for spending some time with us today. Well, on the heels of the important news from the U.S. State Department that the United States will now recognize the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement as anti-Semitic, we're joined again by David Peyman, Deputy Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism at the United States Department of State. As Deputy Special Envoy, Mr. Peyman serves as the lead on fighting the global BDS movement against Israel. In our conversation today, Mr. Peyman and I will speak about the State Department's decisions to both designate the BDS movement as anti-Semitic and all that that means now that this decision has been made. David, welcome back, and thanks for taking the time to be with us.
Dan, great to be back with you again.
Well, there's a lot to unpack here because this issue has kind of been stewing and brewing for so many years. First, tell us about the State Department's and Secretary Pompeo's decision to recognize the global BDS campaign as anti-Semitic and what prompted the designation. And tell us a little about the thought process that went into it.
Sure. So, Dan, last time I was here with you, I indicated that we're going to take a whole of government approach using all available policy and legal tools at our disposal to combat and kill the BDS movement. And the Secretary took a major step toward achieving that objective last week by stating very, very clearly that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic, denying the right of the Jewish nation to self-determination in their historical homeland is anti-Semitic. And the BDS movement is a manifestation of anti-Semitism and also anti-Zionism. I think the Secretary's announcement was, as he said during his press conference with Prime Minister Netanyahu, an obvious choice to make in terms of U.S. policy, but we've made it nonetheless to clearly state that BDS is anti-Semitic. Any organizations that engage in anti-Semitic BDS conduct will be identified by the State Department, by Special Envoy Carr and our team. We will withdraw U.S. support from such organizations that engage in anti-Semitic BDS conduct. And more importantly, we will also engage diplomatically across the globe to ensure that our partners and our allies are also withdrawing support from any organization that engages in BDS. And we're not alone in this. Germany has recognized BDS as anti-Semitic. Austria has recognized BDS as anti-Semitic. And many other countries in Europe have condemned the BDS movement. So I think this is an important initiative that achieves one of our objectives and really speaks to the commitment by President Trump, Secretary Pompeo, and Special Envoy Carr to take a whole of government approach to attack this issue.
Well, the international component is really very significant. And you're right, over the past 12 months or so, there are several countries that have moved to the direction where we are. Of course, there's a lot more to do. But this is a good start. And having Germany and Austria on board, of course, I'm sure will be helpful to our efforts. Now, under Special Envoy Elon Carr, fighting BDS is your responsibility. How does it feel to make this very large breakthrough, both professionally and personally, not only on behalf of American Jews and to assist Israel in this process, but generally, across the diaspora? Jewish communities are looking at this and really have been extremely commendatory. So tell us about how you see it from your particular perspective.
Well, when I was given the opportunity to take on this role, coming from my previous role as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Sanctions and combating Iran and ensuring we have a very robust, the strongest sanctions compliance regime possible against Iran, one of the priorities was always to address BDS. And I'm happy that we got to this point, but we're not going to rest. I think there's a lot more to do. And I think operationalizing the policy executing on the policy that the secretary set forth last week is obviously going to be our next step. And to quote the secretary, we want to do this immediately. There's no time to rest and there's no time to waste. And we are not going to give any organization a free pass. And it's important to know, Dan, that we're focused on anti-Semitic BDS conduct. So there may be organizations that engage in other activities, but to the extent they engage in anti-Semitic BDS conduct, it's important to identify that, to call it out, and to withdraw US support for such conduct. Richard Wagner was a great German composer, but it's also important to recognize that he was a rabid anti-Semite. Now, the fact that he was a rabid anti-Semite doesn't take away from the fact that he was a great composer. But nonetheless, you have to identify anti-Semitism in all of its manifestations, wherever you see it. And if anybody is dabbling in anti-Semitism, they should be on notice that we're going to identify that kind of conduct, and we're going to withdraw US support, and we're going to engage with our allies and partners to ensure their support is withdrawn as well.
When we talk about a definition here in a definitional way, I mean, really what we're saying here is that what the BDS movement is talking about here is the delegitimization of Israel, the double standard that would exist, that there's one standard for everybody and not for Israel. And what kind of definition, let's dig down a little bit further, what kind of definition are you looking at when you're trying to identify those groups?
Well, there's actually already a definition. The United States has at least 2 statutes adopted by bipartisan Congress that clearly defines boycott, divestment, and sanctions of Israel. And that includes any politically motivated activities to boycott or harm Israel or territories controlled by Israel. That's on the books. And Congress has also expressed its position within those statutes that it condemns the BDS movement as defined in the statutes, which is politically motivated acts to economically harm, boycott, divest, or sanction Israel or territories controlled by Israel. So that's the definition we're working off. We're going to take a very robust and careful approach to identifying the organizations that engage in that kind of conduct, obviously with adequate and more than adequate evidence to support any kind of designation.
So Secretary Pompeo also directed the Office of the Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism to identify those organizations that support BDS, support the movement, and determine whether they are working to penalize or limit commercial relations with Israel. So that's really where you're focusing now. And now in practical terms, what does it mean from your perspective and from your research? Where do you think BDS has gained the most traction, and where will Secretary Pompeo's directive have the most impact, do you think?
Well, it's interesting. When you look at the BDS movement, it hasn't had a very strong direct impact, obviously, of boycotts against Israel. However, there have been companies and there have been also investment firms and others, wealth funds, that have taken into account BDS-driven policies in their investment decisions and their business investment decisions in Israel. And so I think this policy will force companies, sovereign wealth funds, and others who are actually employing or using exposure to Israel or entities that do business in Israel, whether it's west of the Green Line or east of the Green Line, because remember, BDS includes any territories controlled by Israel. Those institutions, organizations, NGOs are going to have to revisit their decision-making process, and they're going to have to, I think, revisit to ensure that they are not pulling investments or their portfolios are not somehow quarantining institutions or companies that are doing business in Israel from their investment portfolio. So I think that's a strong practical impact. More than that, to clarify it and to put it on the books as US policy, State Department policy, that BDS is anti-Semitic, I think one of the most important things we can do when we tackle anti-Semitism is define the problem. Without a definition, we're not going to be able to tackle it. And so anti-Semitism in different forms at different times, and it takes different shapes. And this is one of the manifestations that we see today that wasn't here 25, 30 years ago, but it is here today. And to your point as to why it's anti-Semitic, you're absolutely right, Dan. But also, the founders of BDS are on record proudly proclaiming the fact that they want to destroy the character of Israel as a Jewish state. And to your point about double standards, I guess it's not anti-Semitism if an organization were to boycott every single national movement, including the Zionist movement, of all countries around the world. That might not be anti-Semitism because that's a position of you're just against the right for people to have their own nation state. And I guess that could be a position one takes, but then you'd have to boycott not just Israel, you'd have to boycott the entire world. And I guess you can focus on certain Israeli policies and criticize them. But to your point, to the extent others may be engaged in those same issues or have those same issues that they're dealing with, including border disputes. Israel is not the only country that's dealing with a border dispute. Many, many, many other countries are. But if you're focusing and singling out the one Jewish state in the world for an issue that is facing other countries, that's clearly a double standard to your point, and that's clearly anti-Semitic.
Well, it's interesting when you talk about the wealth funds, because that's one aspect. But when we look at the full picture of BDS, you have to ask with each particular case, is this classic anti-Semitism, or is this anti-Semitism disguised as criticism of Israel, or is this purely an economic issue, or is it all of it? As you've encountered it, as you've been following it, where do you think in these three baskets, let's say, of sheer anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism disguised as criticism, or economic, where do you think the balance is here in terms of the real objective here of those who endorse, carry out, campaign for BDS?
Well, certainly when BDS was founded, it was blatant, clear anti-Semitism. The founders were very clear about their objective. Their objective is to destroy Israel as a Jewish state. That was it. It wasn't about any kind of specific Israeli policy. It was about the idea of Israel, the idea of the Jewish nation reclaiming its historical homeland and destroying their ability to do so was the objective. So that's blatant. Since then, I think they've become more sophisticated because they've realized the enormous tsunami of pressure on taking that kind of position. And so they become more sophisticated and were able to attract, I think, NGOs around the world to their anti-Semitic cause. And their anti-Semitism is now manifested in a more nuanced way. So when you're talking about criticizing an Israeli policy and leading a boycott as part of your criticism, again, that might be a legitimate thing to do that's not anti-Semitic. But if you're only focused on Israel for an issue that many, many others are dealing with, that's clearly anti-Semitism. So it's easy to kind of unmask one's intent and motive by seeing the breadth of actors that they're deciding to go after for a specific issue. And this is why the UN Human Rights Council is a council of lies. It's a council of lies, and it's unbefitting of that council to have the UN acronym in front of its name. Because they focus exclusively on Israel. I'd argue that their only purpose is, frankly, to focus on Israel, and they kind of shroud their real aim by throwing in some other agenda items here and there. Israel is the only permanent standing agenda item for the UNHRC. They are clearly an anti-Semitic or pushing anti-Semitic activities. And when you look at the blacklist, the vast majority of companies on that blacklist are Jewish. That is not an anti-Israel blacklist. That's an anti-Jewish blacklist. And we need to call it out for what it is.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the blacklist. I mean, this is pretty extensive, and it is, as you say, this is something at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, and this is clearly aimed as a boycott of Israel. That's what this is, and there are a number of companies on it, as you said. That's why the international impact of this decision now by the State Department is so important, because you, again, mentioning Germany and Austria and others, if this group can gain some kind of critical mass, that will be the best pushback to what we're seeing in Geneva. So it's important to work, and I'm glad you mentioned the Human Rights Council. It's important that that we build that consensus internationally. What kind of reaction have you been getting since this decision was made?
Enormously positive reaction, including a flood of information from folks around the world with evidence of NGOs engaged in anti-Semitic BDS activities. It's really opened the floodgates for us in terms of the amount of data we're getting on different kinds of NGOs. Obviously, I can't state which now, and I can't discuss which organizations may be on a list, but we're getting a wealth of information, a wealth of support. I think you've seen that across different mediums and in different countries. And so one of the things we're also going to be doing, to your point, is not to just focus on the hard tools to tackle BDS. We need to focus on developing global economic, scientific, cultural engagement with Israel. There's no better time to do that now after the Abraham Accords have been signed. We see organic, massive business activity already between the UAE and Israel, also Bahrain and Israel, and hopefully Sudan also as well. So it's important to focus on that aspect of it, but also to take a step back and to make sure that, that BDS is not the only issue that we're combating. When we're combating anti-Semitism, we have to take a strategic approach. I think it has to be a long-term approach. And I'll go back to what I said in our previous discussion. It's a spiritual sickness. It's a virus, and you may not be able to find a cure for a virus, but you can certainly find vaccines for viruses. And there's many different tools that we can employ. And at the end of the day, it's up to the world at large to adopt, I think, some of these tools, including the idea that Jews are not victims of history. Jews have shaped history. Jews have given the world the values that they adhere to today. Values like the belief in ethical monotheism, one just God, rejecting moral relativism, the day of rest. We take that for granted. We take weekends for granted. Some countries have one day, some two, but most countries in the world have a day of rest. That's a Jewish idea. And tikkun olam, fixing the world. Every society is interested in not only helping themselves, but helping others as well. That's a Jewish idea. And the Jewish texts go one step beyond that. The idea of a world is not just the outside world. It's your home. It's your personal world. And the ethical kind of approach you take to that world also matters. And I think that education is lacking. We've done a great job of focusing on where Jews have been victims in history to try to make sure that never happens again. But I think we could do a better job of focusing on where Jews have shaped history and have created the moral and ethical values that much of the world abides by today.
Well, let's just expand on that and perhaps close on that. as well, because I know that this has been the idea of philo-Semitic education as an antidote. You're making a good analogy to the vaccine, but the one of the antidotes to anti-Semitism is this initiative and about philo-Semitism, about educating about the Jewish people. Who are the Jewish people? What are the contributions that we have made to civilization? Who have been the key players through history? Many people know biblical figures, but they don't know down through history. And this is extremely important. But let me ask, because this is a priority and has been made a priority of the Special Envoy's office, what ways can you move that from the idea phase to a practical application?
I think this is an area where we can certainly facilitate Jewish leaders and organizations around the world to come together. And I think you have to do it in a very strategic, targeted way. So a philo-Semitic educational initiative in Russia might look different than an educational initiative in France or in Germany or in England, for that matter. And so I think you focus on specific countries' jurisdictions, work with the Jewish leadership that knows that country the best, that lives in that country, develop the curriculum, the points that I talked about just a few minutes ago, and then partner, and this is where I think the State Department can come in handy and be useful, partner with governments, either national or state, or if you have to, local, to ensure that there is a process and a method and a system to disseminate philo-Semitic education as a response to anti-Semitism, not only through potential educational systems, but also in media, on social media, on the internet. The African American community in the United States is a great example of a community who celebrates their history and does so in a specific month. The month of February is African American Heritage Month or History Month. And we know about that because the community has done a fantastic job of educating us about African American history. And I think Jews in different countries need to learn from that example and have an organized strategic approach to delivering it particular to the countries that they live in.
Yeah, and especially, look, right here in our own country, we have, most of our communities really around the country have very, very few Jews, if any. And so it's all the more important that we stress the idea of education about the Jewish people. Very important immigrant group in this country. My parents were immigrants. And your family is the same way. And it's important as one of the immigrant groups in this country to tell our story. And we wish you well in that particular initiative as well. Well, Deputy Special Envoy Peyman, thank you for updating us on your important work and your office's continued efforts on behalf of fighting anti-Semitism around the world. Really, we're deeply grateful to you.
Dan, I'm very happy to be here with you, and hopefully we can share with you more good news in the near future.
Great. Well, huge thanks to Deputy Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Anti-Semitism, David Peyman, for joining me today. And thank you for tuning in to this conversation with B'nai B'rith. Well, if you like what you've heard, make sure you never miss a program by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and liking us on Facebook. And be sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our important work. See you again. Take care, everyone.